Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of Julio Pérez Silva. In the late 1990s, in the northern reaches of Chile, the landscape is a character in itself. Imagine the Atacama Desert, a place where the earth is so parched, it seems to breathe in the very moisture from your skin. Here, the sun is a heavy, brass weight that hangs in a sky bleached of color, turning the horizon into a shimmering, liquid haze. We find ourselves in the region of Tarapacá, specifically in the coastal city of Iquique and the precarious, rising settlement of Alto Hospicio. Iquique sits at the edge of the Pacific, where the salt spray catches the light and the air smells of the sea. But if you look up, you see the massive, golden-brown wall of the coastal range. At the top of those cliffs sits Alto Hospicio, a plateau carved out of the pampa, a place where the wind carries the scent of dry dust, and the secrets of the earth are buried deep within abandoned mines. During those final years of the 20th century, the silence of the desert began to thicken, not with peace, but with a growing, nameless dread. The year 1998 was a threshold. Alto Hospicio was growing rapidly, a town built on hope, and the rugged grit of families seeking a better life near the booming port. The streets were often unpaved, a labyrinth of pale soil and gray cinder blocks. On the evening of September 15, 1998, a 17-year-old girl named Graciela Montserrat Saravia was walking along the coastal waterfront of Iquique. The ocean was a rhythmic, low thrum against the shore, and the streetlights cast long, flickering shadows on the pavement. She was young, her hair dark and long, catching the cool evening breeze. It was here that she encountered a man in a car, a seemingly ordinary man with a quiet voice and an unassuming face. He was a driver, one of the many who navigated the winding roads between the coast and the plateau. In the soft light of the dashboard, his features were unremarkable, his demeanor calm. But as the car moved away from the lights of the city, the atmosphere shifted. The hum of the engine became a monotonous, hypnotic vibration, and the salt air of the coast was slowly replaced by the dry, suffocating scent of the desert pampa. The transition was subtle at first, until the city lights faded into small, distant diamonds, leaving only the vast, black void of the Atacama ahead. Graciela's disappearance was the first ripple in a pool of dark water. Her body would be found the very next day, abandoned on a beach, a tragic event that the local authorities initially treated as an isolated incident of violence. But the desert has a way of swallowing stories before they can be told. As the months turned into the year 1999, the silence in Alto Hospicio grew heavier. On April 5, 1999, 14-year-old Ornella Linares Cepeda vanished. Later that August, 15-year-old Yvonne Carrillo Lefno disappeared into the same dry heat. These were not just names on a page. They were daughters who left for school and never returned, sisters whose beds remained empty as the desert wind rattled the thin windows of their homes. The families began to speak, their voices trembling with a mixture of grief and a terrifying realization that something was hunting in their midst. Yet the response from the world outside was a different kind of silence. The officials, the police, and the media looked at the poverty of Alto Hospicio and reached for easy explanations. They suggested the girls had simply run away, lured by the promise of work in neighboring countries like Peru or Bolivia. They whispered that perhaps these young women were leading double lives, seeking out the shadows of the night. This indifference was a thick, gray fog that allowed the predator to move unseen, his white car becoming a ghost that haunted the dusty intersections and the long, lonely stretches of the highway. Julio Pérez Silva was a man of routines, a driver who knew every crack in the road and every dip in the landscape. He was a presence that blended into the background of daily life, as common as the dust that coated every surface in the town. He was known to some as a family man, someone who could be seen at local soccer matches or sharing bread with neighbors. But beneath that thin veil of normalcy was a meticulous, predatory patience. He would sit in his car for hours, parked in the edges of the pampa, watching the world through a glass windshield. He observed the schoolgirls in their uniforms, the way they walked in groups for safety, and the moments when one might find herself alone, waiting for a bus that was late or a ride that would never come. His car was his sanctuary and his trap. Inside, the air was stale, smelling of old upholstery, and the faint chemical scent of cleaning supplies. When he spoke, his voice was a low murmur, designed to soothe and disarm. He offered rides not as a stranger, but as a neighbor, a helpful soul in a town where transportation was a constant struggle. He would smile, a small, practiced gesture that never quite reached his eyes, and he would wait for that moment of hesitation to vanish, replaced by the simple, human need to get home before the sun went down. The geography of his crimes was hidden in plain sight. Scattered across the desert floor are the peaks, deep, vertical shafts left behind by mining operations of decades past. These are holes in the world, some plunging more than 200 meters into the absolute darkness of the earth. They are silent places, where the only sound is the occasional skittering of a stone or the low moan of the wind as it passes over the open mouths of the shafts. To the casual observer, they are mere hazards of the landscape, but to Julio, they were perfect, bottomless graves. He would drive his victims far from the main roads, into the heart of the pampa where the ground is a crust of salt and minerals. There, under the canopy of a million stars that shine with a cold, indifferent brilliance, he would extinguish the lives he had stolen. The physical violence was brutal and swift, often involving heavy stones or blunt objects found in the very soil he stood upon. He would then cast the remains into the peaks, watching as they vanished into the blackness, knowing that the desert rarely gives back what it has taken. The silence of the Atacama is profound. It is a silence that can hold 1,000 secrets without ever whispering a word of them to the wind. By the end of 1999, the atmosphere in Alto Hospicio had changed irrevocably. The dust seemed grittier, the shadows longer. Mothers held their children's hands with a white-knuckled grip, and the sight of a lone white car on the horizon was enough to make a person's heart skip a beat. The families of the missing girls were beginning to find one another, their shared sorrow forging a bond that the authorities could no longer ignore. They spoke of the girls' long, dark hair, their slender frames, and the terrifying pattern that was emerging, a pattern that suggested a single, predatory mind was at work. But for now, the man with the ordinary face continued his quiet life, driving his routes, washing his car, and waiting for the next opportunity to emerge from the shimmering heat of the desert. The silence of the Atacama was still holding, but the first cracks were beginning to show in the facade of the man they would eventually call the psychopath of Alto Hospicio. Breathe deeply now and let the image of the vast, quiet desert settle in your mind. We are only at the beginning of this journey into the dark. For now, let the dust settle. Close your eyes and listen to the stillness. The sun of the Atacama Desert is not a gentle guest. It is a weight, heavy and unyielding, pressing down upon the plateau of Alto Hospicio until the very air seems to shimmer with the ghost of heat. As the calendar turned its pages toward the year 2001, this sun bore witness to a quiet, steady erasure. The dust that coated the windows of the small, ramshackle homes grew thicker, as if trying to muffle the sounds of a town that was beginning to scream in a whisper. Each morning, the same rhythm would begin. The smell of frying bread would drift through the narrow streets, and the sound of children's footsteps would echo against the sun-baked earth. But for many families, that rhythm had been severed. The silence in certain bedrooms was no longer the peaceful quiet of sleep, but the hollow, echoing stillness of an empty bed. The list of the missing was no longer a collection of isolated tragedies. It had become a pattern, a dark embroidery stitched into the fabric of the community, though the authorities remained blind to the design. In the months leading up to the new millennium's first year, the disappearances had accelerated with a terrifying, rhythmic precision. Think of Macarena Sanchez, a girl of only 14 years, who stepped out into the crisp air of November in 1999 and simply never returned. Or Laura Sola Henriquez, just 15, who vanished into the light of a March afternoon in the year 2000. These were not just names on a page. They were girls who favored bright hair ribbons and carried heavy school bags filled with dreams of a life beyond the dust. They were daughters who promised to be home by sunset, whose mothers sat by the door until the shadows stretched into long, skeletal fingers across the floor. By the time Catherine Arce Rivera disappeared in April of 2000, and Patricia Palma Valdivia followed in May, a suffocating dread had begun to settle over the hills. The girls were all similar, slender, with long, dark hair that caught the desert wind and eyes that held the quiet hope of the working class. They were the children of the Pampa, and one by one, the Pampa was swallowing them whole. Amidst this rising tide of loss, a white car moved through the streets like a predator in plain sight. It was a common sight, a taxi that promised a safe passage across the treacherous, winding roads that connected the heights of Hospicio to the coastal city of Iquique below. The man behind the wheel was a master of the mundane. He was a neighbor, a soccer player, a man who shared bread and spoke of his dogs with a warmth that masked the void within. When he pulled over to the side of a dusty road, offering a ride to a girl running late for school or a young woman tired from a shift at the market, he didn't look like a monster. He looked like a solution. The click of the car door locking was a sound often lost to the roar of the desert wind. He knew the geography of the desert better than he knew himself, the hidden ravines, the forgotten garbage dumps, and most lethally, the deep, vertical wounds in the earth known as the peaks. These were abandoned mine shafts, some plunging hundreds of meters into the darkness, ancient and hungry, waiting to receive the secrets he would drop into their depths. The fear among the families was matched only by the cold indifference of the state. When mothers walked into the police stations, their eyes red-rimmed and their hands trembling as they held photographs of their daughters, they were met with shrugs and dismissive smiles. The official narrative was a cruel one. The authorities claimed these girls, born into poverty, had simply chosen to flee. They said the teenagers had run away to Peru or Bolivia to find work, or worse, that they had been lured into the neon-lit shadows of the sex trade by their own volition. Each time a police officer suggested that a missing daughter was merely a runaway, looking for a better life, a second wound was inflicted upon the grieving families. They were told there was no crime, only a lack of discipline in the home. Yet the desert began to yield its own evidence, mocking the official silence. In July of the year 2000, the search took a physical, visceral turn. In a sprawling, sun-bleached landfill, the neighbors found a backpack and a school uniform. It belonged to Catherine Arce. Nearby, a bag belonging to Viviana Guerre was unearthed from the trash. These were not the items of someone who had moved away to start a new life. They were the discarded remnants of lives that had been violently interrupted. The most heartbreaking moment of that season came when Iñiaquut's Valdivia, the mother of Patricia Palma, stood at the edge of a jagged ravine. The wind there carries the scent of salt and dry stone, a lonely, whistling sound that never stops. As she scanned the gray earth, her eyes caught a flash of fabric, a piece of underwear snagged on a thorn. She recognized it instantly. In that moment, the lie of the voluntary disappearance crumbled into the dust. The families began to gather, not as individual mourners, but as a collective force of desperation. They walked the desert in lines, shoulder to shoulder, using sticks to poke at the shifting sands. They looked into the mouths of the mine shafts, shouting names that were returned only by the hollow echoes of the earth. They were searching for 14 girls, then 15, then 16. The numbers were becoming a weight that the town could no longer carry. As 2001 dawned, The air in Alto Hospicio was thick with the realization that a wolf was in their midst, and he was being protected by the very silence of the law. The desert's hunger was not yet sated, and the predator's white car continued to circle, its engine a low, steady hum against the backdrop of a community's unfolding nightmare. The air in the Atacama does not merely sit, it waits. It is a dry, ancient weight that settles into the lungs, tasting of salt and pulverized stone. In the late 1990s, this air was thick with a specific kind of dread, a silence that followed the disappearances of the daughters of Alto Hospicio. But inside the police stations of Iquique, that silence was met with a chilling, bureaucratic indifference. When the mothers arrived, their shoes coated in the fine, pale dust of the pampa, they did not find a sanctuary of justice. Instead, they found a world of scuffed linoleum floors, and the sharp, clinical sting of lemon-scented cleaning fluid that failed to mask the smell of stale coffee and old tobacco. The officers behind the scarred wooden desks did not look up with urgency. Their eyes remained fixed on yellowing forms, their pens moving with a sluggish, rhythmic scratching that seemed to mock the racing hearts of the parents standing before them. To the authorities, a missing girl from the shanty towns was not a tragedy in progress. She was a predictable statistic, a ghost already being ushered out of the official narrative. The official response was a tapestry woven from prejudice and apathy. The authorities crafted a theory that was as hollow as the abandoned mine shafts dotting the landscape. They called it the runaway theory. They told mothers like Iñiacute's Valdivia that their daughters had simply grown tired of the poverty, tired of the wind-battered plywood walls of their homes, and had fled toward the borders of Peru or Bolivia. The police spoke of these children, girls of 14 and 15 and 17, as if they were calculated travelers seeking a better life, or worse, as if they had willingly descended into the shadows of the sex trade. The Secretary of the Interior and the high-ranking officers suggested, with a wave of a dismissive hand, that these young women were victims of their own desires, or perhaps the victims of broken homes. They used the family's lack of resources as a shield, claiming that in such desperate conditions, it was only natural for a girl to vanish into the night. Every report filed was a whisper cast into a gale, ignored and shredded by a system that believed some lives were worth less than the paper their names were printed on. Imagine the coldness of a room where a mother is told her child is a runaway while the child's school books still sit open on a small, makeshift desk. In the home of Patricia Palma, the silence was absolute. Her red kangaroo-style hoodie, a favorite garment with its bright color and soft cotton fabric, hung on a peg, waiting for a girl who would never return to slip it over her shoulders. Her textbooks for English and Spanish sat exactly where she had left them, the corners of the pages slightly curled from the desert humidity. These were not the belongings of someone planning a flight across international borders. These were the quiet artifacts of a life interrupted. Yet, when the families presented these truths, the half-finished homework, the lack of extra clothing taken, the absolute devotion the girls felt for their siblings, the authorities merely shrugged. They leaned back in their swivel chairs, the springs groaning in the quiet offices, and spoke of social problems rather than criminal ones. They treated a predator's hunt as if it were a common domestic dispute, allowing a killer to move through the streets with the freedom of a ghost. The pattern was there, visible to anyone who dared to look beyond the veil of classism. Girls like Catherine Arce and Macarena Montesino were vanishing within months of each other, all sharing similar features: slender frames, long dark hair that caught the sunlight, and faces that reflected the indigenous heritage of the North. They all disappeared on their way to or from the same school, walking the same dusty paths where the shadows of the high cliffs stretched long and jagged in the afternoon. But the police refused to link the dots. They refused to see the shadow of a serial offender. Instead, they scrutinized the victims' reputations. They whispered that the girls were loose, that they were seen smoking in the plazas, or that they had been lured away by the promise of easy money. This symbolic violence was a second kidnapping, a theft of the girl's dignity that allowed the physical kidnapper to remain invisible. While the mothers organized their own search parties, combing the jagged ravines and the edges of the garbage dumps with nothing but their bare hands and a desperate hope, the official files sat in dark cabinets, gathering the very dust that the girls had walked upon. And in the center of this institutional vacuum lived Julio Pérez Silva. He was a man who understood the invisibility of the poor. He drove his taxi through the streets of Alto Hospicio, the engine a low, rhythmic thrum that blended into the ambient noise of the town. He was a quiet neighbor, a man who sometimes needed bread and shared it with those nearby, a man who cared for his 3 dogs with a tenderness he never showed his victims. He watched the news reports, those rare, brief segments that mentioned the missing girls, and he saw the police dismissing the cases. He saw the high officials in their clean suits telling the public there was nothing to fear, no monster in the desert, only wayward children. This official denial was his greatest ally. It provided him with a cloak of normalcy. Each time a government functionary spoke the words runaway or prostitute, they handed Julio another day of freedom. They gave him the confidence to keep his taxi idling at the edge of the school grounds, his hand resting on the gear shift, his eyes scanning the sidewalk for the next girl who would trust a kind face and a cheap fare, while the echo of the mother's cries went unanswered in the vast, empty halls of power. The wind across the Tarapacá region does not just blow. It whispers through the sun-bleached structures of Alto Hospicio, carrying with it the fine, red dust of the Atacama. For 3 long years, from 1998 until the late months of 2001, that dust settled over the case files of missing young women, masking the truth beneath layers of institutional apathy. The air in the local police station was often heavy with the scent of old coffee and the metallic tang of unwashed radiators, a stagnant atmosphere where the cries of desperate mothers were met with a chilling shrug. The authorities had convinced themselves of a convenient fiction, a story of rebellious girls fleeing toward the promise of a different life or a darker profession. But beneath the surface of the desert floor, in the profound, cool silence of abandoned mine shafts that plunged hundreds of meters into the earth, a different story was waiting to be told. The transition from dismissal to dread did not happen in a single heartbeat, but rather in the slow, agonizing realization that the silence of the girls was not a choice. It was a void created by a predator who had mastered the art of being unremarkable, a man who moved through the streets in the soft, rhythmic hum of a white taxi, blending into the tapestry of the everyday like a shadow at noon. The turning point arrived on the cold, moonless night of October 4th, 2001. A young woman named Barbara felt the rough texture of the desert sand against her skin and the sharp, sudden impact of a stone against her skull. The world fragmented into shards of silver light and absolute darkness. The man who had offered her a ride, a man with a calm voice and steady hands, had transformed into a monster in the isolation of the pampa. He believed he had finished his work, leaving her for dead in the hollow of the earth. But the human spirit possesses a resilience that even the deepest mine shaft cannot swallow. Imagine the silence of that night, broken only by the ragged, shallow breath of a survivor. Barbara clawed her way back to the surface, her fingers digging into the ancient, salt-crusted soil, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. When she finally reached the light of the town, her testimony acted as a violent gust of wind that blew away the dust of 3 years of neglect. She spoke of the car, a white Toyota, and she spoke of the man who drove it. This was no longer a social problem or a collection of runaways. This was the work of a single, focused hunter. The investigation finally shifted its gaze. The police, once sluggish, now moved with a frantic, desperate energy. They began to scour the records of the local taxi cooperatives, looking for a white vehicle that matched the survivor's description. They looked for a car with plush, felt seats and a small, plastic toy, a yellow monkey or a banana, dangling from the rearview mirror, a mundane detail that would soon become a symbol of terror. The name Julio Pérez Silva began to surface, circling the drain of the investigation. He was 38 years old, a father, a neighbor, a man who lived in a house that smelled of toasted bread and wood smoke. His neighbors saw him as a kind soul, a man who would share his lunch or help fix a broken television. He had 3 dogs that he treated like his own children: El Nacho, the black dog who followed him everywhere, and the 2 he called the Duchess and the Sun. This duality was the most terrifying clue of all. The predator did not have the face of a demon. He had the face of the man who lived next door, the man who carefully combed his hair and bathed every night after returning from the desert, washing away the evidence of his crimes before tucking his own children into bed. The net began to tighten as the police realized that the predator had left more than just shadows behind. In April of 2001, another young woman named Maritza had been attacked but had managed to escape. Though she had never seen his face clearly in the dim light of the cabin, the biological evidence she left behind had been preserved in a cold storage locker, waiting for a name to give it meaning. When Julio Pérez Silva was brought into the station, the air seemed to thin. The DNA tests were conducted with a precision that matched the growing horror of the town. The samples from Maritza's trauma and the samples found in the wake of Barbara's escape converged on a single point: the man sitting in the interrogation room. He sat there with a strange, eerie calm, his voice steady as he began to speak. He did not ask for a lawyer at first. He simply began to recount the details of his work as if he were describing the routes of his taxi. He spoke of Graciela, the 17-year-old he had killed in September of 1998, and of Macarena, the 13-year-old he had thrown into the Huantaja mine shaft. Each name was a stone dropped into a deep well, the ripples spreading out to touch every family in Alto Hospicio. With the confession came the most grueling task of all: the unearthing of the desert's secrets. The police were led to the Huantaja Peak, a vertical scar in the earth that dropped 220 meters into the darkness. The smell at the mouth of the shaft was a mixture of dry rot and ancient minerals, a scent that clung to the clothes of the investigators as they prepared their ropes and lights. As they descended, the temperature dropped, the desert heat replaced by a bone-deep chill that felt like the presence of the dead. The beams of their flashlights cut through the absolute blackness, revealing the discarded remains of lives that had been forgotten by the state but never by their mothers. One by one, the names from the missing posters became physical realities. There was Sarah and Ornella and Laura. The realization was a physical blow to the community. The psychopath of Alto Hospicio was no longer a myth or a ghost story used to scare children. He was a man of flesh and bone who had exploited the invisibility of the poor to create a graveyard in the cracks of the world. The investigation had finally seen through the shadows, but the light it brought was cold and unforgiving, illuminating a tragedy that had been allowed to grow in the silence of the shifting sands. The air inside the interrogation room was thick and stagnant, smelling of burnt coffee and the metallic tang of old radiators. Julio sat there, his hands resting on the cold surface of the table, his expression as flat as the desert horizon he had haunted for 3 long years. When he finally began to speak, his voice was not the roar of a monster, but a dry, rhythmic whisper that seemed to scratch at the silence. He traced a finger across a map of the Atacama, pausing over the jagged lines that marked the edges of the Huantaja district. He spoke of the peaks, those vertical wounds in the earth left behind by miners long ago. And as he whispered the names of the girls, the reality of his confession began to settle over the detectives like a cold, heavy fog. There was no remorse in his eyes, only a clinical, detached memory of where the bodies had been placed. Outside, the sun was beginning to dip below the coastal range, casting long, bruised shadows across the sand, as if the desert itself was preparing for the secrets that were about to be unearthed from its depths. The convoy of police vehicles and rescue trucks wound its way through the darkness toward the Huantaja mine shafts. The desert at night is a place of profound, absolute stillness, where the wind hums a low, mourning song against the rusted remains of industrial machinery. As they arrived at the edge of the first shaft, the headlights of the trucks cut through the gloom, revealing a jagged hole that seemed to swallow the light entirely. This was the abyss Julio had described, a vertical drop of more than 220 meters into the salt-crusted darkness. The investigators stood at the rim, their boots crunching on the dry, crystalline earth, looking down into a void that felt ancient and indifferent. The smell was the first thing they noticed, not the scent of decay, which the arid desert air often mummified, but a heavy, mineral scent of deep earth and undisturbed dust. It was as if the ground had been holding its breath for years, waiting for someone to finally look inside and see what had been hidden beneath the surface of the world. The recovery process was a slow, agonizing ballet of ropes and steel. Rescuers from the Special Operations Group prepared their harnesses, the nylon webbing creaking as they tightened the straps. One by one, they were lowered into the mouth of the shaft, their headlamps flickering like lonely stars against the walls of rock and salt. As they descended, the temperature began to drop, the air turning sharp and cold. The walls of the shaft were narrow, lined with the scars of old pickaxes and the remnants of rotted timber supports. The rescuers moved with a heavy, rhythmic caution, knowing that a single loose stone could trigger a collapse. Down they went, 50 meters, then 100, then 200. The silence at those depths was absolute, broken only by the rasp of their own breathing and the distant, tinny crackle of the radio units. It was a descent into a forgotten world, a place where time had stopped for the 14 souls who had been cast down into the shadows by a man who claimed to be a simple taxi driver. At the very bottom of the shaft, the light from the headlamps finally touched the floor, and the horror of the Huantaja Peak was revealed in its entirety. It was not just a burial ground. It was a scene of frozen, preserved tragedy. Because of the high salt content in the soil and the extreme dryness of the Atacama, the remains were often found in a state of haunting preservation. The rescuers moved with a soft, reverent touch, their gloved hands uncovering the small, everyday details that broke the heart. A single sneaker with its laces still tied, a colorful hair tie tangled in the dust, a backpack that still held the school books of a girl who never made it home. They found Macarena and Laura and Patricia lying in the quiet dark as if they were merely sleeping. Each discovery was marked by a heavy silence on the radio, a pause in the work as the weight of the loss settled over the team. These were not just statistics or names on a missing persons file. They were children, found at the end of a long, dark journey through the desert floor. As the sun began to rise on October 10, 2001, the first of the stretchers was brought back to the surface. Up at the rim of the shaft, a crowd had gathered, investigators, forensic experts, and the families who had spent years searching for a truth they were now terrified to face. The winch groaned under the weight, a slow, metallic wail that echoed across the plains of Alto Hospicio. When the stretchers emerged from the darkness, draped in white, a collective sob seemed to ripple through the gathered crowd, carried away by the morning wind. One by one, the victims were recovered, a grim procession that lasted for days as multiple shafts were searched. The total count reached 14, a number that stained the history of the region forever. The desert had finally given up its secrets, but the cost was a hole in the heart of the community that no amount of earth could ever fill. The search for the missing was over, but for the families standing in the pale light of the Atacama dawn, the long, quiet walk through grief was only just beginning. The wooden benches of the courtroom in Aquique were worn smooth by the restless movements of families who had waited years for a single word. Inside, the air was heavy and still, thick with the scent of old paper and the sharp, metallic tang of nervous anticipation. The overhead fans turned with a rhythmic, lazy click-clack, cutting through the silence, but providing little relief from the stifling heat of the northern coast. Every eye in the gallery was fixed on the man in the center of the room. Julio Pérez Silva sat with a terrifying stillness, his features cast in deep shadow as he waited for the final judgment to be read aloud. It was February 26th, 2004, a day that the people of Alto Hospicio had lived and relived in their fitful sleep for years. The dust motes danced in the shafts of light that filtered through the high windows, drifting aimlessly like the memories of the girls who were no longer there to see the sun. You could hear the faint, distant sound of the city outside, the honking of horns and the call of gulls. But within these walls, the world had come to a complete and hollow standstill. The judge's voice was steady and low, a drone that seemed to vibrate against the cold, unyielding stone of the courtroom. He began to read, and his words were a litany of 14 lives, 14 names that had become a collective prayer for the entire nation. One by one, the sentences were delivered with a gravity that felt like the earth itself was shifting. Qualified life imprisonment. These were words that carried the weight of the Atacama Desert, a commitment that the man responsible would not see the light of freedom for at least 40 years. In the gallery, the silence was finally broken by the sound of soft, ragged exhales, the sound of 100 held breaths finally being released into the humid air. Families clung to one another, their knuckles white as they gripped framed photographs of daughters whose smiles were frozen in time. Silva remained impassive, his face a blank mask, a void in the middle of a storm of human emotion. The justice served was absolute and final, yet it felt like a thin, fragile veil over a wound that still pulsed with a deep and quiet ache. Alto Hospicio is a place defined by its edges. It sits high on a plateau, looking down at the shimmering sea, surrounded by a landscape that remembers everything but says nothing. The wind there is constant, carrying the fine, pale dust of the pampa, a dust that finds its way into every crack and crevice of the homes and the hearts of those who live there. For a long time, the town was scarred not just by the crimes themselves, but by the devastating silence of the authorities who should have protected its children. The empty spaces where young girls once walked, laughed, and dreamed are now filled with a different kind of presence, a heavy, lingering awareness. People in the streets speak of the lost years as if they were a season of permanent winter in the middle of the desert. The mine shafts of Huantaja, once symbols of the region's industry and hidden wealth, have been reclaimed by the sand and the shadows, becoming unintentional monuments to a darkness that the community had to face alone when the world chose to look the other way. Justice, when it finally arrived, could not undo the quiet devastation of the early years, but it planted the seeds for a slow, arduous healing. The legacy of this case is a complicated tapestry woven from grief and the fierce demand for reform. It is found today in the way the local police listen to the families of the vulnerable, a lesson learned at a cost that no community should ever have to pay. In the heart of Alto Hospicio, small, humble memorials stand against the wind. You can see the crosses adorned with sun-faded ribbons of pink and blue, plastic flowers that have turned brittle and white under the harsh, relentless ultraviolet light, and handwritten notes where the ink has been partially erased by the salt air. These are the quiet markers of a town that refuses to let the names of the 14 fade into the background. The families carry these names like precious, fragile artifacts, speaking them to the wind and to the stars, ensuring that their daughters are remembered not as victims of a monster, but as vibrant individuals who had dreams as vast and as endless as the horizon. The desert is quiet now as the evening settles in. The white Mazda Capella that once prowled the dusty, unpaved streets is a ghost of the past, and the man who drove it is a number behind iron bars in a distant, cold city. But the silence that now covers Alto Hospicio is no longer the sharp silence of fear. It is the soft, heavy silence of a long and necessary rest. The shadows of the plateau stretch out toward the Pacific as the sun dips below the water, painting the sky in deep shades of violet, gold, and ochre. The stories of those who fell have been woven into the very fabric of the earth here, a permanent reminder of the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable shadows. We leave the town now in the fading light of the afternoon, watching over the homes and the hills that finally found their peace. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.